Welcome back. We are getting back and we are getting away from the theory and just GAN and getting into the actual part of what you need to do. Now here we will try to make it as real world. I was inspired that by someone I spoke to, real world as possible. And the main aspect is we will talk about the theories, we will talk about the basic parts, the nuances of practicality there, but then I will actually take you through what really happens and what happens. When we talk about this topic, MVP, minimum viable product, it's the way most companies are going. It's an often used term, but very less understood. We are trying to demystify that a bit. But remember that even the features on the Google or Microsoft that you see comes with the word beta. Remember, the word has moved into a place where there are perennial beta things. Everything is in beta, everything is in MVP, but they are curating and making it better every day. That's a true state of thing. It is not a static aspect. You'll have to do several MVPs, probably a continual MVP structure for some section of your audience all the time. So it's very important to understand all the attributes that go into the MVP stage. Let's start with the definition. It's a minimum viable product. What does viable mean? That's a key word. Minimum is understandable, okay. Product is understandable. The thing in the middle, that's the most tricky, is viable. Viable always means business viable. That means someone is willing to pay money for even that part that is there. Someone is getting value out of that part of it. That's why it's viable. It's a viable business idea. Please remember that. It's not a viable tech stack or a viable product feature which is the minimum part. People should be able to use it and think this is worth paying for. May not be willing to shell out more unless you put in some frills and all, but still willing to go for it. So the steps are very, very similar to what we have done, but just reinforcement of them. Step 1, identify the core problem and need. We have talked a lot about this part of it, but it's important to reiterate as to what exactly are you going to build and what inspiration and what problem are you trying to solve. So let's say that the previous steps have given you 7 problems. From that you narrow down to 3, which is the core problem or need, and that becomes your thing. इसके नीचे तो होगा ही नहीं, ये नहीं होगा तो कोई नहीं लेगा. That is the kind of crux that we are talking of in step 1. Step 2 is outline the core features of the MVP. It's very important. The need and the features are interwoven, and the way someone solves the feature or the need is the feature. I can do copying in n number of ways, but the fact that the feature is I can drag my mouse, highlight the word, and then do a right click or do a control C. These are all features that I am adding on. I may not have added the control C. Why do I do it? Because I realize not everyone is very familiar with right click, or they can keep the right hand busy if they are a right handed mouse person, and then use the left hand to do a control C, and then their productivity increases. So many of these things are sometimes hidden in plain sight and you discover them, and that gives a wow factor to your product. Features are very important. It could be a visual feature, it could be an interactivity feature. It is a differentiator and it tells the user surrogately that, hey, I understand you very well. I know what you dig, I know what you hate, and I have built it just for that particular perspective. This is what makes the whole tone or the culture of your company visible, is the feature. So when a Zomato is publishing a new feature and putting on LinkedIn, why are they doing it? To establish the factor of being a thought leader, of being empathetic, of understanding user needs and propagating it. And that's what it does. An MVP is the best way to propagate your initial values, because you are an unknown. That is the first entry to the user psyche you are getting, and the user is going to, first impressions matter. This is the first impression. The user is going to form an opinion of you based on that first impression. So I cannot overstress on this part of the feature building for the MVP. Then obviously, don't walk the talk. Build the bloody thing. Build the MVP. This is where you will learn a lot about yourself, how your team is functioning, what you thought, what is there. Every teething problem you will face here, everything that you oversimplified can come and kick you and say that, hey, you misjudged me. Something you thought as an unsurmountable problem may actually feel easy to do when you are actually going to do. This is welcome to the real world moment. This is where Morpheus leads you out of your dream and into the real world. Just remember that this is the crux of it. Let me underline it. And in the words of a famous brand, just do it. That's when you really mean what happens. Step 4, you have made it. Now you have to launch. But remember, this part is very important, a targeted audience. Your MVP typically is not for every user, even in the narrow target audience you have done. It's an even much more targeted persona sub that you are looking at it. So when I say targeted, don't mistake it for the target audience which is broad. This is a targeted audience. Targeted is different from target. Spay of English, but important. It's an even smaller thing which you can control, from where the subsequent steps are easy. Even if it's your target audience, but you cannot do the next 2 steps, which we'll come to in a moment, that's not a targeted enough audience. The second 2 steps are gathering customer feedback. So your targeted audience must imbibe the vibe that it is somewhere you can gather feedback from easily. So the most voracious ones, in gaming we call them the beta users, the more enthusiastic one, always willing to try, they are my targeted audience. Though the game may be meant for millions of people. But this is the way, because I know they will give a lot of feedback. I know that will be constructive. I have my expense. If you give it to everyone, the feedback that will come will be very stupid. Change the color to purple. Doesn't help. But change this thing, the shadow is not coming properly. So the targeted audience is someone who can add value. In a real world, when you really go into it, if you as an entrepreneur can have the humility and obviously a payback mechanism, these are a very important part of your stakeholders. So choose the targeted audience carefully. A selection of this can be a make or break between a successful product and unsuccessful. Go to your harshest critics. Don't just give it to people you know will like the product. Go to people who disbelieve. Convince them to use the MVP. Their feedback may be the most crucial for your survival. Third one, analyze and iterate based on the feedback. This is the key word. If you don't do this, you are dead. Iteration is the key. How you gather feedback is just an ego factor. Oh, I gathered 1,000 feedback. What the hell did you do with it? This is what you do with it. And unless you do it, the MVP stage is a waste. So MVP is not just about getting the product out. It's about imbibing and factoring for it to make sure that. What does it mean? You have to keep budgets. You have to keep resources. You have to keep time to make sure that you stabilize the MVP. So make sure that when you're planning your timing and all, don't be optimistic. I get the MVP out in 7 days, I'll publish. It may be 7 days, maybe 70 days, maybe 7 months. Depends on each project. There are many people who stay in the MVP for a long. They are not stupid necessarily. Could be, but not always. One doesn't sort of prove the other. It is the time it takes to do all these steps to get to that part. We may have a plan for how many iterations you will allow. And you may say that I will not iterate till I have accumulated so many problems. Those are tactics, but the strategy doesn't change. You have to let people do it. Now this is the theoretical part onto that part. What's the most difficult part of an MVP? This is the part where you don't have a product, it's difficult to get funding. You have to build the product, you need funding. This is where you come up with your angel investors, and I call them faith investors because they're having faith in you and the idea, and they come in and put in the money. Without that, the MVP will not happen. Without the MVP, the big picture will not happen. It's a very crucial thing for testing whether anyone is willing to even fund the idea, whether people believe you enough. It could be a factor. You can get funding from someone who only believes in you, thinks you're a brilliant guy and you'll figure it out, or loves you too much. Doesn't matter. But you should not take that for granted. That's the biggest honor. This first set of people who come and back you are the people who really love you or love your idea. Never ever let go of them. Never try to shortchange them. People may come in 100 times the money, but none of them will come with even 1/100th of the conviction these guys are showing on you. So be respectful. People things matter. I'm going to talk a lot about these things because these are the things you'll not find in the books and in the things of it. Maybe there are articles and all. We'll correct you, as I keep on saying, your reading material will have a lot of more detail about all those things. But I wanted to say this thing upfront to you. In the next part, I will actually do some active drawing on the board because the build-up will be important, and then tell you how the MVP concept is a perennial concept throughout that part and what are the mantras of a survival of that part. We'll stick on the topic of MVP, but tell it as if you have done it. So I'm not going to go sequential because nothing is sequential. You always do iterations and fractals of the same activities throughout the lifespan of your product. That's what we'll tackle on this one. This is a start point. not the end point. MVPs will keep on coming back and back and back. Thank you for now. Take a short break, clean up the board and start again.